Joining us right now, we're all in our best behavior, everybody, because it's the FCC Commissioner, Brendan Carr. And he's a very nice gentleman. I had the pleasure of meeting him. I think it was in D.C. One of the last times, Commissioner, I was in D.C. I had the pleasure of meeting you. Welcome to the show. We are very well behaved here.
Well, so good to join you, and we will steer clear of any F-bombs or anything that will get you in trouble, but I can give you one get-out-of-jail-free card, but that's the best I can do.
Told you. I told you that would happen.
I'm still
anyway,
cautious.
Commissioner, I know this is something that you've spoken quite a bit about. You've written about this, and I want to talk about the broadband stuff as well, because how we're doing it and how we're defining it obviously are two different things. But as it relates to communist Chinese technology, we've talked about the 5G and the foreign policy, national security ramifications. What are we doing in terms of technology and communication in order to limit having to rely on any contribution from China at all whatsoever, and just for our own national security's sake, keeping them out of any of that planning, out of any of that actual infrastructure going forward?
We really can't understate the threat that the Communist Party of China poses, and in particular, allowing their spy gear into our communications networks. And this is an issue that in Washington, D.C., I think both political parties were a little bit asleep on until a couple of years ago when President Trump started raising the profile of this issue. So at the FCC, we took a number of steps to kick out Huawei and ZTE gear. Now, those decisions only went so far, though. It kicked out gear to the extent that it's paid for with federal dollars. So a carrier could put that exact same spy gear into the network today using private funds. And so I recently called for the FCC to close that glaring loophole and prohibit all Huawei, all ZTE gear that poses a security threat from getting into our network, regardless of the source of funding.
Yeah, that's incredibly important as well, because I mean, this is one of the reasons why I won't use Zoom. I won't put it on anything I own. I mean, that's the littlest step that I can make, because there's just some concerns. And I hear from people, Commissioner, that people who object to it, they say, well, I didn't really, is it really going to matter if we have this technology involved in whether it's, anything with 5G or the spyware, et cetera, because, I'm not doing anything, day to day. Most American people aren't doing anything. We're just living our lives. But that's really not the ultimate point. And because this does affect every single American. And it's not so much whether they're watching someone, check out the latest season of Jack Ryan, the series. It's, there's more to it than that, correct? Obviously,
the threats come in at a lot of levels. So, for instance, there was some data that was being sent from California to Washington, D.C., and in that route, there was a entity owned by the Communist Party of China. Well, that data got rerouted through Guangzhou, China, and the California to Guangzhou to D.C. route is not the most efficient or direct route of moving traffic. I was up in Great Falls, Montana. This is, big sky country. Dotted throughout Montana are hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles. We keep them in silos up there. I met with Colonel Jennifer Reeves. She's in charge of that entire regime up there. And spread throughout that missile silo are cell towers running on Huawei gear. And they're able to pull in a lot of information from having that infrastructure up there in our fields. And even to your point, data on our cell phones. It's amazing the amount of information people still don't understand that your phone can collect and apps on your phone can collect. If you go into a taxi cab, there's barometric pressure meters in your phone that know when that door has closed. It knows how far you're going up in a building. So the threats are very, very real in terms of the amount of data, the different types of data that the Communist Party can collect if their gear is inserted in our network.
Goodness, that's all absolutely terrifying. Well, I don't. Good heavens! And it's important that we're very vigilant on this. Moving over to infrastructure at large. Obviously, I've seen you tweet about it. You have a piece also, which I want to discuss over at The Hill. You wrote an editorial about broadband, and this is one of the things that's been included as infrastructure. I think it's probably fair to say that broadband is infrastructure. Whether or not we're going to regulate this stuff as a public utility is a whole other discussion, perhaps. But the $2 trillion American Jobs Plan, as you wrote about this over at The Hill. Talk to me about this, because so far from what I understand, like they had all of this reserve cash for for expanding connections, for subsidizing internet service and all kinds of stuff. But apparently not where's the money at? Because none of this has actually gone into effect.
You're exactly right. So at the FCC right now, we have over $40 billion that has either been set aside or budgeted through an FCC vote to bridge the digital divide. That's supporting high-speed internet builds to rural communities that have nothing today, and that's subsidizing service for low-income Americans that can't afford it. Not a single penny of that $40 billion has gone out the door yet. And if you look back to candidate Biden, he had pledged a moonshot $20 billion for rural broadband. So right now we have sitting at the FCC double what candidate Biden pledged. And on top of that, there's hundreds of billions of other dollars available. But yet we're about to pour $100 billion more on top of these unspent dollars through Biden's infrastructure plan. It just makes no sense. The plan itself has other serious substantive flaws as well. But at a minimum, let's spend the money that's targeted. Let's figure out how much of a problem remains after we do that. Let's just not pour hundreds of billions of dollars on top of that.
Yeah, we're speaking with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. Commissioner, one of the other big topics of conversation that everybody has had as social media has grown, and now it's considered, I guess, popularly speaking, as a public forum, obviously, is big tech and Section 230 as it relates to facilitators of conversation or whether or not they're acting as, editorialists. I'm so torn on this issue because I come at it from a very limited government, quasi-libertarian conservative perspective, respecting private business. But at the same time, I also understand corporatist interest in suppression of expression through corporate means, which I don't want conservatives to labor under the assumption that it's only government that can suppress you. It can also be big corporations. Where do you stand in the FCC on this issue as it relates to Section 230? And what rights do private businesses have, like Twitter and Facebook, et cetera? But at the same time, they're still, which it kind of is a separate question, they're still enjoying protections that completely neutral facilitators would enjoy, as opposed to the publications, which is what they seem to be acting like.
I think you're exactly right. Big tech has more control over more speech than any institution in history. I think we're seeing a very biased application of the power. And you laid it out exactly right. The biggest challenge for conservatives is to figure out how do we hold big tech accountable while continuing to stay true to our core principles. And I think we can do that. Some in DC have said, well, we just have to sit on our hands. There's nothing we can do. They're big companies and we love big companies. But those days are changing. I think now we're seeing a shift in the politics in Washington where conservatives realize we need to hold big tech accountable, that they are a great threat to individual liberty, which is what we care about. And sure, that threat to liberty comes in the main from government, but increasingly large corporations with outsized power over our lives can do it. So I propose a path forward that would hold big tech accountable that doesn't violate their First Amendment rights. And I think we can do it. We can bring transparency, we can bring accountability, and what I call user empowerment. And reforming Section 230 is a piece of that, because really courts have read Section 230 and given it an expansive definition. Justice Thomas has written about this a lot recently on the Supreme Court. So there is a path forward for conservatives to hold big tech accountable without violating our core principles of limited government.
Right. I think that's, and I love that you said also reforming it as opposed to repealing it. We're talking to FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, Commissioner, and that's just a last bit on that. And the Clarence Thomas thing, I was reading that. I know that there's going to be a showdown over this at some point. But that really comes down to if you are a facilitator, because this all stemmed from internet comments. I mean, ultimately, that's how this all came about in the 90s. People didn't want to be held accountable for what commenters were putting on their websites. And that was in the days of the Wild West Webernets. And now you have Twitter and Facebook and those algorithms. I mean, that is a form of editing. So if they're going to edit, and that's ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, what your position is, if you're going to edit content, be it through algorithms or another means, then you're not really presenting information. You are not a facilitator. you're basically just like any other publication. And, you know, the Washington Post has to meet one set of standards. So if Twitter's acting in the same vein as Washington Post, then they should also face the same sort of liabilities from unprotected speech the way that newspapers and magazines do if they're going to edit.
I think you have that right. Section 230 today operates as both a sword and a shield.
Right.
And the shield portion of it is pretty uncontroversial, that if someone else's speech is on your website, you're not liable for that speech. The person who said it is. That's pretty uncontroversial. The problem with Section 230 that a lot of people ignore is the sword element, which is their ability to take speech down and to actively censor. And that's a portion of Section 230 that, again, I think courts have misread. And you talked about the algorithms. 230 today basically says if a website is itself contributing to the speech, then it is their speech. Then they just are like the Washington Post. And again, I think courts have missed the game on that one as well. So I think we can move forward in a way that holds them accountable, because this is so core today. I mean, right now, there are very serious attempts to drive political dissent out of the public square, and free speech has been in retreat. And so it's incumbent on all of us to stand up against sort of this culture of censorship, as well as the legal errors that have been made along the way.
Yeah. And very interesting as well how so much of this resembles that, just taking it back to China, how so much of it resembles that the credit scores that people receive for behaving, how much freedom they're allowed on some of these private platforms. FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, we appreciate what you're doing to curb Chinese espionage and protect our technological infrastructure, as well as free expression against corporatism. We appreciate the fight and appreciate your time today. We'd love to talk with you again. Thank you.